As the great and wise Yoda may say, "No, you don't what you don't know." In other words, you don't know what you don't know. This video will take you on a brief journey through time, highlighting our country's legislative evolution, which promotes equality for historically marginalized groups, followed by diving deeper into understanding the impact they have had in the lives of the people that the laws sought to empower.
Before we start our journey, we'll be using this framework when diving deeper into the impact of our legislative wins attempting to promote equal rights. To help you visualize this a little better, let's discuss in comparison with Christianity. Starting at the top, systemic influences are the cultural, historical, and value-based aspects that influence our economic and political systems, public policies, institutional practices, and social norms. Think of Christianity as the systemic influencer. Next, at the institutional level, we have policies and practices that are informed by systemic influences. So, the many types of Christian churches represent the institutions whose policies and practices are often similar, but may have some differences between them. For example, some require you only to attend church on Sundays, while others will also require Sunday school and extra days for Bible study. The unit or individual level represents the people or groups whose behavior is guided by the institutional policies and practices. This would be the church leaders who encourage people to continue coming to church, to give them offerings, and to encourage people with children to complete the sacraments of Christianity, such as baptism, First Communion, and confirmation. Lastly, the individual impact is the impact that the unit behaviors have on individuals engaging within the unit and within the institution. This would be the impact on parents or children who attend church feeling proud for having completed the sacraments, or feeling guilty for doing so because they really don't intend on attending church regularly.
Our journey will focus precisely on the legislative evolution attempting to promote and advance equal rights for Blacks and African Americans and women. Can you imagine how people would react if one of the terms for getting married was that one of you would legally cease to exist as an autonomous individual because you had to give up your voice and accept that you could not influence any political, social, or economic choice? Crazy, right? However, this is what it meant for women to get married back in 1769, and it was not until 1990 that each state had legislation that gave married women some right over their property and monetary earnings. However, this attempt to give women more power to affect systemic change and gain equal rights was merely a band-aid because we did not win our voting rights until 1920. Between the 1930s through the 1970s, there was increased progress to instill and protect women's rights to equal pay from discrimination in the workplace, in education, in housing, and other social, political, and economic domains. Although progress had been made by the year 2000, the Me Too movement is just one example of how many people are recognizing that the work to promote equal rights and opportunity for women needs more than institutional policies. However, don't just take our word for it. Let these numbers tell you the story.
Initial progress was evident in the first few decades after sudden rush in legislations promoting equal rights for women. However, earnings disparity has remained fairly stable since about 1995, despite there being almost as many women in the workplace as men, and by age 25, a larger percentage of women have a bachelor's degree than men do. So the major takeaway, you ask? Although there have been institutional level attempts to promote equal opportunity, it is clear that there are systemic level influences that continue to act as barriers to making the necessary changes to promote truly equal opportunity.
An alarming fact is that the current average median income for women is roughly what it was for men in the mid-1960s. When broken down based on occupations, women make an astounding 30 to 40% less than their male counterparts, including in occupations that are not historically male-dominated. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end here. Women also continue to experience higher rates of discrimination at the group level and individual level, such as receiving less support from senior leaders in the same job than men, being treated as if they were not competent, they're denied more promotions, endure microaggressions, and feel more isolated at work.
When we dive in deeper, these statistics illustrate the daunting reality of how the intersection of multiple historically marginalized identities, in this case being a woman of color, leads to increasingly disparate outcomes due to the increased barriers they experience. So what are we learning here? Intersecting historically marginalized identities leads to more disparate outcomes. The reality of why we are seeing more and more people speak out against systemic sexism and promote equality by using social movements like #MeToo to galvanize and elevate the voices of the people most impacted is because of continued disparate outcomes in the workplace for women, in addition to other aspects of life, because although the legislations promoting equal opportunity continue to be necessary, it is also clear that a multi-level approach is necessary to truly influence systemic change that'll transform the power dynamics that is necessary to eliminate these disparities over time.
For the past few months, no matter what part of the country you live in, you don't have to look too far to hear or read something about the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's pro or against it. This highlights the need for us to dig in a little deeper to truly understand why, like the Me Too movement, this movement has become a worldwide effort that starts even before the legal importation of slaves into what we know today to be our home and country. America has moved from legal importation of slaves to the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 through the fight against legal segregation and then gaining protection from housing discrimination led by the federal government using red line maps and from discrimination in the workplace with the help of Title VII. The fight for African Americans and Blacks to gain equal rights and shift the power dynamics so that they too can live free and foster positive systemic change for everyone has lasted for hundreds of years. Despite the efforts to dismantle racism by the way of political, economic, and social actions, the existence of redlining in our country tells a story about how powerful institutional racism is and why it is up to all of us to come together and work collectively to foster systemic change.
Redlining was a discriminatory housing practice that used appraisal maps developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation and enforced by the Federal Housing Administration for over 30 years. This categorized areas within cities where Black and African Americans lived as hazardous that led to the systematic denial of mortgages or insurance based on the racial composition of the applicant's neighborhood rather than the creditworthiness of the borrower. The power of institutional racism is evident when looking at a current-day map of Philadelphia, showing how effective this lending practice was. That was deemed illegal in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed, at maintaining largely segregated communities. However, this is not the end of the story. The impact of institutional racism that redlining continues to have in the lives of Black and African Americans across the country exists in how it informed other institutions. That has ingrained it in a way that requires us to look deeper into the story. Like in Philadelphia, the red line areas of the 200-plus major cities impacted by it continue to experience the highest rates of poverty, have the lowest funded public school systems because of how funding is intricately tied to property taxes, acting as a barrier to educational opportunities, experience significantly disproportionate rates of criminalization, lack equitable access to healthy food and public transportation, have the highest rates of health disparities and mortality rates that are upwards of 20 to 25 years lower when compared to the areas of the city that were green or blue, and have higher rates of children who've experienced adverse childhood events.
Racism and sexism impact the lives of millions of people in their ability to access education, housing, social support, transportation, public safety and criminal justice, help in childhood adversity, health resources, and other opportunities, all of which are factors that directly or indirectly determine their employability. Although it may seem daunting, we believe that HR professionals are uniquely capable of influencing the equitable process within the workplace because they exist in all industries and may play a central role in leading and/or supporting ongoing diversity and inclusion initiatives in effort to foster increasingly equitable workplaces.
We adapted the framework we presented using Christianity as the systemic influencer to illustrate a simplified mechanism for how systemic sexism and systemic racism become ingrained into our everyday lives. We then adapted that framework to illustrate the power dynamics within the workplace with the Human Resource Department and professionals represented at the group level with the capacity of influencing the power dynamics at the individual and organizational or institutional level. This framework illustrates how HR departments and professionals are uniquely capable of leading and supporting diversity and inclusion initiatives at all levels within the workplace in an effort to foster equitable change. We define diversity as inviting someone to the workplace's decision-making table. Inclusion is asking that person to share their opinions, perspectives, and experiences to help inform the decisions at that table. And equity is sharing the decision-making power that informs the workplace's policies in a way that transforms the power dynamics and influences the organization's culture that actively work to eliminate sexism and racism within the workplace. We believe that HR departments and their professionals are uniquely capable of engaging at the individual, group, and institutional levels within the workplace to develop, lead, and/or support ongoing diversity and inclusion initiatives that are strategically developed to address the devastating impact systemic racism and sexism continues to have in the lives of Black and African Americans and women in the areas that we have categorized as the social determinants of employability. We believe that fostering equity in the workplace is intersectional, is a continuous process that involves internal and external stakeholders that can be difficult and complicated at times and should always center and elevate the voices of historically marginalized groups. This systemic power dynamic framework we developed does not encompass how systemic racism and sexism are institutionalized in all aspects of life and within the workplace, highlighting its enduring and evolving nature. Therefore, like the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movement, the strategy we present here is an effort to promote the elimination of all forms of racism and sexism within the workplace and is intended to bolster the growing efforts to eliminate systemic racism and sexism in all aspects of life.